Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Ana Paula Brita. I'm director here at BMJ, and today we have Tim Stratford joining us here. My first question to him was actually, how come and why did you end up in China? And we had a long conversation already, so I'll skip all my introduction and let you introduce yourself. Good morning, Tim. Thank you for coming.
Good morning. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is my very first visit to Brazil, so I hope that I will learn a lot. Everything I see makes me more and more interested in your country, and so I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for hosting this. I am a partner in an American law firm called Covington and Burling, and I've been managing the office of this firm in Beijing for the last 12 years, and then most recently I've entered semi-retirement.
Oh.
But I first moved to China with my wife and children in 1982. At that time, China had just barely opened to the outside world. They had just a year or two earlier passed the first law that allows for foreign investment in the country. They didn't really have much of a legal system. I wrote my senior paper in law school on China's contract law, and the first challenge I had was they didn't have a contract law, so that made writing the paper rather challenging. But from 1982 until now, we have seen enormous changes in China. It's now quite a wealthy country in many of its cities. It's become technologically advanced in some key technologies, and it's a very different situation, but it's been fascinating for me to observe the changes in China over this period of time. For part of the time, I've worked as a lawyer. Part of the time, I was in-house counsel at a large American car company. I worked at the U.S. Embassy from 1988 to 92, and then from 2005 to 10, I was in Washington, and I was assistant U.S. trade representative responsible for U.S. trade negotiations with China. So I feel fortunate that I've been able to look at China from the perspective of a diplomat, and also working in a company, and also working as a lawyer for many clients.
Very nice. Thank you so much for your introduction. And Tim, if we go over decades, what would you say were the biggest highlights ever since you changed to China towards trade and the relationship with the U.S.?
Well, if you listen to President Xi Jinping of China now, he talks about China entering the new era. So if you think big picture, you can think about eras. And the first era of modern China could be the Mao Zedong era, from 1949, when the People's Republic was established, until about 1978-79, when Mao had died and Deng Xiaoping led a series of reforms that led to the opening of China and economic reform and so on. So starting in about 1979, you have the Deng Xiaoping era, and that's the period of reform and opening up, normalization of relations with the United States, introducing a lot of foreign investment, bringing in more ideas of market economies, joining the World Trade Organization in 2001. This is all part of the philosophy of Deng Xiaoping in the second era. So what is the new era of Xi Jinping? Well, if you think about the difference between Deng and Mao, you could focus maybe on three differences. One difference is that during Mao Zedong era, the power of the country was focused in one person, and everybody studied Mao Zedong thought, and you had your red book, and everything was focused on power in one person. So that was one thing. Another thing was that China was focused on a state-led economy with you didn't really have private farmers, you didn't have private industry. It was focused on the state. And then the third thing was that China was quite closed off and had very poor relations with the United States and with other Western countries. So if those are three hallmarks that helped to define the Mao Zedong era, what did Deng Xiaoping do in 1979? He opened up the economy and said there should be more market forces. We should have private plots for farmers. We should have private enterprise, and we should welcome foreign investment. So that was a major change. He normalized relations with the United States and worked to have a good relation. The idea was, if China wants to focus on development, it will be easier to do that if we have good relations with the US and other Western countries rather than if we're closed off. And the third thing that he did was he said, we had many problems in our country because all the power was consolidated in one person. We had the Cultural Revolution. We had the Great Leap Forward. So we should have a kind of consensus leadership amongst the top leaders of the Communist Party. So those are three hallmarks of shifting from the Mao Zedong era to the Deng Xiaoping era. So what is the third era? Well, if this is the Xi Jinping era now, one thing is the power is being consolidated again back into one person. And you have Xi Jinping thought as a governing force. It's hard to hear any speaker, any public statement by the foreign ministry, any speech in China that doesn't quote Xi Jinping thought several times. And he has tried to consolidate the power again under himself. The second thing, there's more of a focus again on the state and the role of the party in running businesses and the economy. And the party is reinserting control in a more detailed way in the economy. And the third thing, now the US-China relationship and China's relationship with some other Western countries has deteriorated a great deal. It's more like it was during the Mao Zedong era in some ways. So you might say, well, if China made so much progress during the Deng Xiaoping era, why is China changing back to things that seem similar to Mao in some ways? Well, here's a way that you could understand it from the Chinese point of view. Let's talk about consensus leadership. Why does Xi Jinping feel like he needs to pull the power back into himself? Well, his criticism of the Deng Xiaoping era was that the way consensus leadership had evolved, it was leading to a lot of corruption. So how did consensus leadership work? Well, I'm in charge of the military, you're in charge of the oil industry, you're in charge of something else. And I can do whatever I want to with what I'm in charge of, as long as, and I'll let you do whatever you want to do as long as you don't interfere with me, and vice versa. So that allows us to create our separate fiefdoms or our separate kingdoms. I do this, you do that. We're nice to each other because we allow each other to do what we want to. And so you end up with corruption, and you end up with not the strong progress in some areas that you want to make. So Xi Jinping said, our party has become corrupt. We need a strong leader to put the party more in control so that we'll get rid of the corruption. And I will just be the chair of each of the committees and make sure that we're doing it right. So that's the shift from consensus leadership back to power controlled in one person. So what about the economy? Well, China in many ways has reached the end of the development model that worked so well during the Deng Xiaoping era. How did they grow their economy so rapidly? Well, a big focus was on exports, building their manufacturing. The state can subsidize certain industries and build their manufacturing, and they can export. But if you're growing 20% a year, after so many years, pretty soon other countries say, wait a minute, we can't take 20% more a year of what you're selling us. And you're subsidizing your industries, and our industries can't compete with that. And so they can't keep growing by building more factories and exporting. And they also were growing their economy by investing in infrastructure. But you can only make so many new airports and so many new highways, and then you don't get a good investment. And they were building their economy by their housing sector. But now there are millions of unfinished homes because the housing sector has kind of gone bankrupt. So they have serious problems in their economy. So Xi Jinping is saying, we need the state to take control. We need to fix the problems in the economy. And the old system isn't working anymore. And then in terms of China's openness to the rest of the world. This is
I was actually going to ask you, how do you see Brazil getting into this tripod? Because we see under the perspective that we have the two biggest players here, US and right. At the same time as China. Right.
I'm sorry that we're causing you so much trouble. If you look at China's looking at the US, let me explain how that looks and then see where does Brazil fit into this, okay? So from a US government perspective, and I used to be a US official, the idea was, well, there are a lot of things about what China's doing that we don't feel very comfortable with, but China's still quite poor, they're not very powerful, and we can kind of live with that, and we hope that gradually as we work with them, they'll change some of the things that make us feel uncomfortable. If they subsidize their industries, well, so far their industry is still sort of small and it doesn't hurt our industry so much. Or if they are talking about taking over leadership of Taiwan or pushing some of the other countries in the area in terms of their boundaries. China talks a lot, but they're not really doing anything, so it's not a big problem. But now that China has become much more powerful and much more wealthy with a lot more influence, now in the US government, the feeling is, well, we can't overlook these challenges anymore because now China is in a position where they can really carry out some of the things they've been threatening. And their economy is now so large, it's threatening our industries. So now we have to do something different from what we were doing. So that's the US point of view. On the Chinese side, they say, now that we're rich and powerful, why do we have to do what the United States tells us to do? We can do our own thing. We do what we think is best for China. Or in the point of view of the leaders, we do what's best for the Communist Party to stay in power.
Yes.
So now the problems that used to be overlooked by the U.S., they don't think the U.S. doesn't think they can overlook them anymore. And on the China side, they think we don't have to do what the U.S. tells us. We're China. We can make our own decisions. So where does that put Brazil? Of course, in some ways, I'd like to ask you this question, right? But if you look at some of the things that the United States is doing, I was in a meeting with the Vice Foreign Minister in China in 2019, and I knew this Vice Minister for many years, and so he said, Tim, we have come to a new conclusion that it is now the policy of the U.S. government to undermine Communist Party movement. And if that's not U.S. policy, the U.S. government better let us know very clearly and very quickly. If you're the Communist Party and you feel that the U.S. now is trying to undermine the rule, then you're going to take a very defensive position. Mm-hmm. And so what the Chinese have been trying to do, and this is where Brazil fits in, they are trying to identify every place where the United States potentially has leverage over them and trying to eliminate that leverage. So if China is buying soybeans from the United States, which has been a very important export from the U.S., of course, they're afraid that the U.S. might say, okay, we don't like what China's doing here, so we're going to cut off soybeans. And of course, this is a very important food commodity. So what will China do?
Buy from Brazil.
Absolutely. But so what's going on is that China is trying to identify every place where the U.S. has leverage. Key technologies, semiconductors, and other things like that.
Desligou? Desligou?
Oh, it's off. I was being censored. I'm sorry.
Melhorou?
Is it okay now? Okay.
Funcionou? Volta?
Okay. Oh. Sorry about that. So China is trying to look at every place where they are vulnerable, first of all to the United States, but also to like-minded countries like the United States. And if we need semiconductors, if we need this kind of food, if we need this kind of raw material, if we rely on the US market for our exports, we have to figure out how not to rely on the US anymore because we don't want the US to have leverage over us. Okay, so that's been going on. And the United States has been doing the same thing. Where does China have leverage over us? And one place we discovered that was during the pandemic, because some of the key pharmaceutical ingredients and even face masks and protective clothing to wear when you're dealing with sick people, we were getting this all from China. And at that time, it was not because China was trying to take political action against the US. It was because of disruptions in shipping and supply chain. But nevertheless, we realized that we were very vulnerable to China. So what you have going on now is China trying to eliminate its vulnerability to US pressure, especially economic pressure, and the United States trying to do the same thing. But there's a problem. it's not so easy to eliminate this vulnerability. Our economies are very tightly integrated. And China realizes this. So they are trying to gradually eliminate vulnerability, but not too fast. And so what happens if you're an American company, and we can think about whether this applies to Brazil. If you're an American company, the Chinese government is saying, we welcome you, come and invest, here's our market, we'll treat you fairly. But what they don't say in the same sentence, but they say in the next room is, we must have self-sufficiency. We must develop our own technology. We cannot rely on other countries. So if you're a foreign investor, you're thinking, China's a big market, but they're also trying to not need me anymore. So what kind of a future do we really have investing in the Chinese market? And the Chinese are feeling the same way about the US. So each country doesn't want to hurt itself, but it wants to eliminate reliance on the other. And how to do that is very, very tricky. So then you can say, how is this going to affect Brazil? Well, in some ways, you're a little bit in the middle. China's your most important trading partner. So imagine that Brazil was in the same position as the United States. You don't trust China. They're trying to eliminate their reliance on Brazilian soy and oil and iron ore and things like this. What would you be doing? They still need you, but they're trying to find another supplier. And there's a question of leverage. Suppose there's a vote in the United Nations, and the United States hopes that Brazil will vote in this way, and China wants you to vote in that way. And China says, if you vote with the United States, we're probably not going to need your soybean quite as much as we did before. Do you like to be put in a position where political pressure can be put on you because of your economic dependence? Well, you probably don't. But on the other hand, China needs her soybeans too. So we're doing this very delicate dance of needing each other, but not wanting to need each other, and figuring out how to navigate that space. And you sort of have to figure out, hopefully you don't want to make the United States angry at Brazil, but you don't want China to be angry at Brazil either, but the United States and China are angry with each other. Do you have any friends like this? It's very tricky, right? Okay. Right. So I guess the major way that I would describe the difference between them is this. Take the word decoupling and the word de-risking. Okay. So decoupling means our economies are linked together and we want to de-link them, make them more separate. And the Trump administration previously, and also some of the advisors to Trump who may be in a new administration, they are more focused on decoupling. They say, China is going to be our enemy. Everything we do to trade and invest with China is helping them to be stronger when we fight with them. So we should try to separate ourselves as much as possible. When in 2019, during the Trump administration, I was the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China, and we visited Washington, and I met with people at the White House in the National Security Council. And they said, we think you just shouldn't be doing so much business in China. And I said, well, is that because you're afraid that maybe they will take some of our technology, our IPR, or do other things? And he said, no, you just shouldn't be doing so much business with them. And that's a very radical concept when you consider how important China is in the global economy and the markets and as a supply base and so on. So the Trump administration is more hawkish about trying to separate the economies. The Biden administration, and I think a Harris administration, are more selective. And so instead of saying just decouple, there's more of a sense of we should de-risk. That is to say, let's look at the places where the United States sees risk in doing business with China, and let's protect those areas. But if we can avoid, if we can still do business and not have a very specific risk, we should do this business. It's best for everybody. So one of the formulas that you hear from the Biden administration, and I think you would continue to hear from the Harris administration, is small yards and high fences. That is, figure out a space or an area, a type of technology or a type of business that you think this is particularly dangerous. If China develops their AI or their quantum computing, this could change the balance of military power. Therefore, we should do everything we can to prevent China from getting the key elements of this technology, and be very strict about that. But we should try to have as much open space as possible that we can do business in the other space. So how does it feel when you're in the business community and trying to deal with this? Well, figuring out where those fences should be is very tricky, and technology keeps advancing. And if you block sale, for example, some of our semiconductor manufacturing equipment, if we say, okay, you can't sell that to China anymore, you have to make sure that the Dutch and the Japanese are also not selling the same technology, or else you're just hurting your own industry. But even if they agree, this is a substantial amount of revenue that your companies used to get that they can't get anymore. And they were using that revenue for R&D to be more advanced. So are you actually helping your own competitiveness by blocking those sales, or are you hurting your competitiveness? So these are the kinds of things that the U.S. government is struggling with, and why it's an ongoing process. So the way I describe it is not just a small yard with high fence, but I would say it's a small yard with a high fence with a minefield all around the fence, because you don't know, if you're trying to sell a certain product, whether it's going to be a problem in the future or not. So that's having an effect on reducing some of the business that we do. Maybe I could just mention one other thing about the relationship. When I was in Beijing in April, I met with a senior party official from the Communist Party. And she said, I think US-China relations are a kind of dynamic stability. If you think about that, that's a little bit of a contradiction in terms. It's dynamic, but it's stable, right? I said, well, I think that's a good description, but I would add one more word to your formula. I would call it a fragile dynamic stability. So what do we mean? Well, it means that the relationship has its ups and downs, but those are within certain boundaries. So it's kind of stable within those boundaries. It's moving inside the boundaries, but the boundaries are there. So what are the boundaries? At the top level, US-China relations are not going to improve beyond a certain point, because by now the distrust and the difference in interests is just too great. It's not going to be resolved. We're not going to go back to the way it was in the early 2000s or the 1990s. We just don't trust each other enough. So there's a ceiling, and the relationship's not going to get better than that. And there's also a floor. The floor is neither country wants the relationship to get so bad that it keeps going downhill. So we have a kind of a floor, and we're both going to make sure it doesn't get worse than a certain level. So if you think about the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, President Trump was pushing on the relationship, all the tariffs and the trade war and all of these kinds of things. And this is part of what I was saying, that the United States said, we can no longer close our eyes to some of the things we see China doing that we think are harmful. So the Trump administration really is the administration that embarked on that new assessment. And what you can see is that the Biden administration has basically agreed with that. There's a lot of consensus in Washington between the Republicans and the Democrats that we did have to take a different approach. But when Biden became president, there wasn't much of a floor, and we didn't know how far downward U.S.-China relations would go. But the Biden administration said, look, it's in the best interest of both countries to have a floor and make sure the relationship doesn't get too bad, because it could threaten world peace. I mean, it could threaten the global economy. So the Biden administration worked hard to send officials, you know, the Secretary of State, the Treasury Secretary, to try to establish some guidelines between China and the US that we would, this is what we're both trying to do, and we're still going to be punching each other, but we're not going to do it beyond a certain level, so that there's a floor. And it took quite a bit of time for the Biden administration to establish that kind of understanding with the Chinese. And we thought we were going to do it. And then the balloon comes over the United States, and it looks like the military is taking pictures of our military bases. And we have all these kinds of things. But finally, President Xi and President Biden say, okay, we understand what each side is doing, and we'll live within those bounds. So that's why, you know, the US will keep putting new sanctions on Chinese companies because, oh, you're selling to the Russians and helping the Russians in the war against Ukraine, or you're doing this. So the US keeps doing this, but they do it for certain reasons within certain bounds. Okay. So that's why we're within this area. So what happens if Trump is elected? There's a concern that because they're more hawkish, they will be pushing downward on the relationship, and it might break through the floor we have now and become worse than it is right now. We could have a trade war. If, you know, there are people around Trump who are saying we should take away PNTR, permanent normal trade status, for China. If so, then the whole basis of the WTO falls away. Okay, and Trump has said 60% tariff on everything we import from China. Well, if he does that, and we're hearing from people around Trump that they are pretty serious about doing some of these things, and our assessment is that the president does have certain legal instruments whereby they could do that. The concern is that he might aim at the whole thing. Okay, so if I come back to the formula of fragile dynamic stability, we're floating here. If Trump is reelected, he may crash through the floor of it. Now, if he does, I still think that both governments will realize we have to put another floor on because we don't want a war, and we don't want these things. But we may go through an uncertain period again where both governments figure out what the new floor should be. So if you're Brazil and you're watching all this, it's a little bit hard to know exactly where things are going. I think it points out that we have to keep a close eye on this dynamic. You know, one of the most common things that I get in my legal practice now is major global companies will call and say, the Chinese our Chinese competitors in China are getting much more advanced. And if we want to stay competitive in the China market, we should invest another $2 billion to upgrade our factory and our R&D facility in China. If we don't, then it's only a matter of a few years and we basically are not going to be in China anymore. Should we make that investment? Okay. So if you sit back and say, well, this is a really important decision. The China market has been the largest growing market for their product in the world. You can't just turn away from a market like that. But is the Chinese government going to allow them to be successful after another 3 or 5 years when they don't really need this foreign company anymore? Or is the company's government going to get into a fight with the Chinese government and there'll be retaliation and it will affect your ability to do business? So there's a lot of uncertainty. And when we try to help companies or industries figure out what to do, we look at what is China's own policy and goal with respect to that industry, and should we expect that we're going to have space to operate that or not? I mentioned I used to work for a large U.S. car company. The U.S. car companies right now, I mean, when I was there, China was our most profitable market, and it was growing very rapidly. But now you're hearing the leaders of some of the big foreign car companies saying, China now is so competitive in making electric vehicles, and they get so many subsidies from the government and so much support, we're not sure that we're going to be around here in another few years. And this is, an entire industry. And so the first question is, how is this going to affect you in the China market? But then it also says, China now is making more electric vehicles than the China market itself can possibly absorb. They're going to ship a lot to other countries. How is that going to affect the auto industry in the other countries? So I see that BYD has announced a big investment in Brazil. So that will be good. It will create a factory. It will create jobs. To what extent is their supply base also going to be from Brazil, or are they going to import a lot of the components from other countries? All of these things are going to have a major impact on our industries in our other countries.
Yeah. We noticed in the first semester of 2024 an increase in imports of Chinese cars. We have about 100,000 cars already here in the country, especially because of movements towards also tariffs, increase of tariffs here for imports.
Right.
The Brazilian industry is also suffering a lot with the imports. And what we notice here in Brazil actually is a movement, I think about 5 years ago. Before this period, we used to say that made in China was bad. It was bad quality. It was almost something you use once and you throw it away. And we've noticed that throughout even small things like until cars, we can see the increase in quality, and there is a movement of if it's made in China, it's good.
Mm-hmm.
And they're actually making it through, especially with cars here in Brazil.
Right.
In the US, I went there in April. I hardly saw Chinese anything. I was going to ask, do you think this is already a movement, even as a protectionist policy from Biden, or Americans don't actually really like?
Well, Chinese manufacturers are very cautious about the U.S. market. They think that's the most important market. They would love to become successful in that market, but they're not sure whether they'll really be welcomed there. And if you hear a major presidential candidate who might be reelected say we're going to put a 60% tariff on everything, then are you going to invest a lot now to develop your brand and your distribution in the United States for that? And if you take EVs, the U.S. has already slapped on 100% duty on the EVs. So what this means is the Chinese first choice might be to sell in the big American market, but that looks too uncertain. Let's sell it to Brazil again instead. And that will work very well for people in Brazil if you're not competing with that same product. It's interesting. I've been advising some U.S. car companies about how to deal with the EV industry and, should they make that next investment in China and all these kinds of things. But now I'm having clients come from consumer products. Of course we get a lot of, our iPhones are made in China and a lot of our flat screen televisions and a lot of these things are made in China. But I have a client now who's a major consumer product, a product, a company everybody would know. And it turns out that to make some of their products, even though it's a simple household product, to manufacture it is very expensive and you have to make a big investment, just like you do if you're going to build cars. Mm-hmm. And they're saying that now there are Chinese companies in their sector that are poised to flood the U.S. market with their consumer product. And I was surprised that even this product, I wish I could tell you the kind of product because you would be amazed. But they're afraid of it in their product too. And so now that China has been trying to fuel its growth, they can't build more airports and houses, so they're building more factories and they want to export. It's across the board in a lot of industries, and it will affect different countries in different ways depending on what industries you have in your own country and what China will be doing in those industries. So this is, please understand, I'm not anti-China. Raised my family there. My children grew up speaking native Chinese, going to Chinese schools. Not anti-China, but the way I describe the situation is by using a sports analogy. Football. Okay. Now, as soon as I say football, you're going to say, what does this American know about football, right? So we go to the stadium to watch the big football game. And on one side of the field, we have the winners of the World Cup. And on the other side of the field, we have the winners of the US Super Bowl. Okay? Both of those teams are there to play football, and they're very good at it. And we're very excited, except wait a minute. This team's idea of what football is and this team's idea of what football is very different. And think about the difference between American football rules and your football rules. And this analogy is worth thinking about because I think that a market economy is like your football. You go on the field, you adapt very quickly to changes, and there are certain rules. You can't grab a player on the other team and throw them on the ground, right? But because you're not afraid that the other person's going to grab you and throw you on the ground, you can kick the ball over your head and you can do all these wonderful things that you would not dare to do if you were playing in an American football game, right? Okay, so you unleash a type of entrepreneurial spirit because you're adjusting to quick changes on the field, and you unleash a type of athleticism or innovation that you don't have in American football. Now, what about American football? American football, actually, when you study it and watch it, it's a very engaging game. But you have big players in the front line that are supposed to protect the other people. It's like a state-owned enterprise in China. Big protections and the protection from the state. And between every play, they have a huddle where they say, okay, this is what our play is. And every person on the team has an assignment to carry out that particular play. That's like a planned economy. And everybody's working together to follow the same plan to try to get the ball down the field. So it's a very different concept, and it also makes for a good game. But if you have the two teams on the same pitch playing by the different rules, it doesn't work. And see, that's what we have with China in terms of economics. Our economy and their economy, they can say, look at how advanced we've become. Look at how rich we've become. Look at how the very high quality products we can manufacture. But it doesn't fit on the same field with the way we play. And so what are we going to do about that? And that's a real challenge.
It is. Tim, we had about 5 questions from our audience. I think we already went over 4 of them. I'll read here just to make sure. But what can be expected about China's positioning and trade strategy under Harris or a Trump administration? We went through this. Trump was the protagonist of a trade clash with China during his first term with a major global repercussion. This year, Trump called for a 60% tariff on all Chinese goods. How worried should we be about the trade war 2.0? Harris has already declared that she's not a protectionist Democrat. At the same time, she tends not to make any major changes to Biden's approach to China. With tougher instances and imposition of tariffs, could we see any change of direction in this medium or long term? I think that between Harris and Trump, we see that they wouldn't be so protectionist as, for example, Trump. Would you say some comments about this?
Well, I think in both the Trump world and in the Harris world, there are some contradictions in what they're trying to do. I want to do this, but if I do it, it might hurt this other thing that I also want to do, and I'm not quite sure how I'm going to resolve the tension between the goals. So if you talk about Harris, her focus is on middle-class Americans. Wall Street has gotten rich by trade, but this has hurt factories that have closed down and middle-class Americans, and we should focus on what middle-class Americans need. So that means we need to create more jobs, and we need to help people so that they can have affordable health care, and we can make sure that they have affordable housing and things like that. If you're focused on creating jobs and doing those things, there may be some tensions between doing that and, opening up trade more and letting more products and things come from other countries. So that's something that it's hard to say in advance. How are we going to make that balance, and which industries are going to be more protected so that we can have jobs? So, one of the other differences I didn't mention between Biden and Trump on China is Biden has said, yes, we need to block China from getting certain key technologies, but we also need to focus on developing them more in our own country. We invented semiconductors, but now very few of them are made in the United States. They're made in Taiwan and in other countries. We need to bring more of those back here. And so they have, the income or the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act and all these things to subsidize building new factories in the United States. So that kind of thing is, you could see Harris continuing that focus on developing the American manufacturing and R&D base more. But if you're spending billions of dollars to build your own industry, how is that going to affect your trade agreements with other countries? Subsidies are problematic under the WTO under many circumstances. Are we navigating that, and are we creating a situation where we're doing these subsidies, so Europe feels like they need to do subsidies and you need to do subsidies? So there are changes with how we're thinking about trade. And what I understand is that in the Biden administration, our Treasury Secretary and our trade representative have talked with the Europeans and said, okay, we all want to have clean energy, and so we're going to subsidize the clean energy industry. Let's talk about how we're going to do it, and let's talk about how you do it, so that we're not throwing money at the same thing, but we're doing it in a way that ultimately may make sense. That's a very different way of talking about trade agreements from when I was a USTR person. I would always go to China and say, you're not following your WTO commitment here, and you're not opening up your market here, and you're blocking agricultural trade this way. And I was all about trying to get them to follow their commitments to open markets. But now that's really not what the discussions are about. So there's been quite a change in policy. Trump seems to have different priorities. He seems to view things in terms of profit and loss, as a former businessman. So he looks at trade and says, there's a trade deficit with this country. We're losing. We need to make some change so that we have more balanced trade. And he seems to be focused on evaluating trade from that perspective. And so on the one hand, we could see him putting all these tariffs on China, but is he doing it to build American jobs, or is he doing it to have another trade negotiation with China? It's a little bit harder to see.
Do you see the WTO gaining protagonism again?
Here's my own personal opinion. When I was at USTR from 2005 to 2010, we were following kind of traditional trade policy. Open up markets. The whole world will benefit from this. Greater global wealth will be created. And so we should open up markets and promote trade. But, as I've thought about it more recently, that belief is based on certain assumptions about how the world is operating. What are those assumptions? Well, the first one is that we have a set of global rules that all the major players are following, and that if you follow these rules, trade will be fair. I won't do something that will give me an unfair advantage over your companies and your products and so on. Okay, so you have to have rules that really deal with the world and make sure that we're all playing fairly on what we would call an even playing field. That's the first assumption. The second assumption is that there's a way to enforce those rules effectively and promptly so that they actually work. One of the things I found with China is, while I was at USTR, we brought 5 WTO cases against China. But it took so long to solve the case that by the time we were done, the damage had already been done. they'd already localized a particular industry, or they developed their own industry so that by the time our companies came in, it's very hard to compete. So you have to have rules that cover the rapidly changing global situation, like data and all these new technologies and so on. And you have to have an enforcement mechanism that works. The third thing you have to have is political support in all the key countries for their government to have this kind of trade policy. And if people are losing jobs, if people say, oh, they have unfair labor practices in their country and that's why they can sell it cheaper in our market, if they have those kinds of things, then you won't have political support to have these trade agreements. And that's a situation that we can see around us in the world right now, certainly in the United States. So that's the third assumption. Fourth assumption is that the trade rules are taking care of climate and labor and other issues. Yes, you can put human rights very much in that. Most people, at least in the West, think that if this country is able to sell their products cheaper because they have forced labor, or because their factory is a big polluting factory and they save a lot of money by not having environmental protections, that there's something wrong with that, okay? So the fourth condition is that you have rules that deal with environment and labor and human rights. Fifth assumption, that if there is some kind of a global disaster or a pandemic or other things, we have a secure supply chain. And our supply chains were seriously disrupted during the pandemic. And so a lot of people said, even though it would be more efficient to have this product manufactured in this country, we need to bring some of it into our own country just to make sure that if there's another shipping cutoff or something, that it doesn't harm us. Okay, so supply chains resilience is a good condition. One more condition, national security. We have to make sure that the way we're trading doesn't undermine our national security and give some advantage to potential adversaries. So those are 6 conditions that really underlie the idea that we should have free and open trade. Mm-hmm. So out of those 6 conditions, which of them do you think are well established in the world today, and you don't have to worry about that condition that's taken today? Rules that cover everything, effective enforcement, political support in our own country, taking care of the environment, human rights, supply chain resilience, national security.
Very good. And our last question, do you think the diplomatic stance of non-aligned and its growing importance on the international stage allow Brazil to benefit from the China-US relationship, especially when trade barriers between the two countries are high?
Well, I think that... Okay. Oh. Well, here's what I would say. If you have a kind of an unstable situation that you're dealing with, then maybe you can watch very carefully and you can get some advantage right here at this moment. And you can get some advantage right there at that moment. And certainly, Brazil needs to pay very close attention to U.S.-China relations and how that creates opportunities for you or how it might create risks for you. There's no question that you need to keep a very close eye on that. Are you better off in an unstable world where you get an opportunity here or you get an opportunity there? Or are you better off in a stable world where it's predictable, you can plan on a longer term basis, you can make investments? I mean, maybe maybe Trump comes into office again, US-China relations get bad, the Chinese buy less of the soybean and other products from the US, and they say, we're going to buy them from Brazil. But then Trump does a trade deal with the Chinese, and now they're going to buy more soy from the United States. And this could fluctuate like that. Is that really the kind of world that we want to live in? So what I would say is you will have opportunities and you may have some risks in this environment, But I think we'd all be better off if we can figure out how to have more stable relationships where we all understand that doing certain things will ultimately benefit everyone in the best way.
Well, Brazil has been doing its homework. I think we've been working on our agreements or on trade agreements. We have Mercosul trying once again to work and attach all the connecting points to have a protagonism here in Latin America. We do have opening negotiations with other regions in the world as well. And we obviously won't let this dialogue between China and the US go away from our, I can't say comfort zone because it's not a comfort zone, but it can't stay off our table, of course, because we do need to know how to deal with our opportunities, with the barriers, and see where we can actually have more income and establish our trade balance overall. Do you have any last considerations or remarks for our talk today? We're going for an hour of transmission.
Sure. As we think about stability, you want to have as much autonomy and as much control over your own future as possible. So on the one hand, you don't want the United States telling you what to do, and you don't want China telling you what to do. You want to be able to make your own choices. And part of the challenge with that is that other countries have leverage when you have a lot of trade and investment with them. There are some countries that have benefited a lot from Chinese infrastructure investment, but now that seems to be used as leverage, or maybe there are problems repaying debts. And so some of the autonomy and the progress that was originally envisioned turn out to be problematic in some ways. So the question is, how can you maintain a strong, robust trade relationship with China and with the United States, but not have either one of them have so much leverage over you that it pressures you to do things that you don't think are in your own interest? So that's one thing to look at, is see where there's leverage and pressure and try to structure things so that people can't put their thumb on you and press you to do things. I suppose the United States may put pressure on Brazil from time to time. I'm certain that China does that with other countries too. And figuring out how to navigate that and maintain your own autonomy as much as possible, I think will be an important goal and challenge.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. That's it.